There was a spark, a loud pop, and then the most glorious shriek I'd ever heard from over the fence. Karen, my entitled neighbor, screaming like her Gucci sneakers just caught fire. Technically, it was her son's ATV charger that caught fire. And technically, she had it coming. You don't steal power from an electrical engineer and expect to get away with it. Not after I warned her. Not after the HOA ignored me. And definitely not after she told me, laughing by the way, "It's just a little juice, lighten up." Oh, I lightened up all right. I lightened up her entire backyard with enough voltage to turn her off-brand ATV into a toaster. But let me rewind. You need to know how we got to this perfect, explosive moment of karmic justice. Because it didn't start with sparks. It started with a subtle blip on my home energy monitor. See, I'm not just some guy with a multimeter and a grudge. I'm a certified systems engineer who designs power infrastructure for data centers. Electricity is my love language. So when my solar inverter started logging phantom drains during off-peak hours, I noticed. Most folks wouldn't. But I'm not most folks. I live in a quiet neighborhood where people brag about their lawn edges and homemade compost, and I keep to myself, tinkering with my home grid and watching for anomalies. That week, I'd noticed something weird. Every night between 1 and 3 a.m., there was a 1.8 kilowatt-hours dip that didn't match any of my devices. It wasn't HVAC. It wasn't the hot tub. It wasn't my backup battery cycling. It was something external. That was when I started suspecting the leech next door. Karen. You know the type. Impossibly expensive sunglasses, voice that carries like a foghorn, and zero understanding of the concept of personal boundaries. She had moved in 2 years ago after a messy divorce, and ever since, it had been a parade of poor decisions, wine-drunk brunches, and HOA violations that mysteriously never got enforced. Her favorite pastime was making up new neighborhood rules and citing the HOA like it was the Constitution. She once yelled at a 10-year-old for riding his bike too close to her hydrangeas. But lately, her obsession was this souped-up electric ATV she got for her teenage son. It was loud, obnoxious, and worst of all, it ran on electricity. I first noticed the cord while I was trimming hedges. An orange extension cable slinking like a snake over the back fence. It looked like it came from her side and disappeared behind my tool shed. I blinked. That's impossible, I thought. I didn't have any outdoor outlets back there, unless, no way she'd be that bold. That night, I turned off all my exterior breakers except one, just to see. The next morning, there it was, a dip in the logs at exactly 2:12 a.m. I walked out, followed the fence line, and sure enough, the cord was gone. Retracted. Hidden. But not before I got pictures. I decided to confront her gently. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe her son plugged it in without realizing it was mine. I walked over the next day and rang her bell. She answered wearing yoga pants, sunglasses, and holding a mimosa like she was the queen of brunch. I mentioned the power drain. I asked if, by any chance, someone in her household had used my outlet. She blinked, smiled, and said, "Oh, that? Yeah, we figured it was no biggie. Just a little charge while we waited for our garage panel to get fixed. You've got solar, right? You barely notice it." I barely notice it? That's not how electricity works. And also, not how permission works. I tried to explain that it was theft, however small, and that it affected my system balancing. Her response? She literally patted my arm and said, "Relax. You're such a tech guy. It's not like we're draining your car battery or something." I left before I said something I'd regret. But my mind was already working. I called the HOA and reported the theft. They said they'd look into it. 3 days later, I got a warning letter for creating hostile neighbor dynamics and unauthorized modifications to shared structures. Apparently, Karen claimed I had installed dangerous traps along the fence and was threatening her family with electric shock. I was stunned. But I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I'm not a confrontational guy, but if you plug yourself into my grid without asking, And then lie about it? Oh, now you've entered my domain. Karen didn't know what she'd triggered. She thought I was just a quiet guy with solar panels. She didn't know I designed fail-safe systems that power military-grade servers. She didn't know I'd once built a self-contained backup grid for a hospital using nothing but spare parts and caffeine. And she definitely didn't know I was about to turn her little midnight joyride into a very expensive fireworks show. I began sketching out the plan that night. I'd design a decoy outlet, something she couldn't resist, wired to a perfectly legal, perfectly safe, but utterly devastating surprise. Something that would leave her charger in ruins without endangering a soul. It had to be subtle. It had to be invisible. And it had to be personal. Because she hadn't just stolen power. She'd insulted my craft. I installed the fake outlet on my side of the fence, angled just enough to look forgotten, like I'd lazily left it wired to a tool shed junction. I made sure it looked tempting, unguarded, live easy. But it wasn't. The outlet was connected to a carefully tuned impedance circuit that would fry any charger drawing more than 3 amp. No house appliance would trip it. But an ATV charger? Oh, absolutely. I set the trap. I watched. And I waited. 3 nights later, the cord was back. Coiled. Plugged in. I watched from my workshop, sipping tea. At 2:17 a.m., the log spiked. Just as I'd planned. The circuit did its job. There was a bright blue flash, a loud pop, and then the crown jewel. Karen's shriek piercing the night like a karaoke machine caught in a blender. I watched her son run out in his boxers, trying to figure out why his precious ATV was now billowing smoke like a Halloween prop. I'd never smiled so hard. That was just the beginning. Karen thought she could steal from an engineer and walk away. But the voltage she fried was nothing compared to what I was about to unleash. Because when the HOA got involved again, they made one fatal mistake. They backed her. And that meant war. The morning after the great power surge of Karen's backyard was one for the books. I woke up to the sound of her stomping around in slippers, muttering loudly about sabotage and calling the fire marshal. I stood at my kitchen window, sipping fresh coffee like I was watching live theater. The cord had vanished again, the ATV was tarped over like a crime scene, and Karen had her phone glued to her ear, presumably unleashing a dramatic retelling of how her child was nearly electrocuted by a booby-trapped outlet. Except there was no electrocution. Just a fried charging unit and a mother who didn't understand that karma sometimes comes with fuses. But I wasn't celebrating yet. That had only been the first act. She hadn't learned her lesson. In fact, by midday I received a visitor. A man in khakis and a golf shirt, clipboard in hand, wearing the smug expression of someone who thought they were about to lay down the law. You can't just install unauthorized electrical devices along a shared boundary, he said, not even introducing himself. Apparently, Karen had complained to the HOA again. And now, they were here to scold me for hazardous installations that endanger the community. I tried to keep a straight face while he quoted bylaws to me, most of which had nothing to do with electricity and everything to do with Karen's creative interpretation of the HOA handbook. I explained that the outlet in question was on my property, legally installed and wired to code. What he didn't know, and what I chose not to mention just yet, was that it had been rigged with a non-lethal surge induction loop that tripped when a specific current threshold was breached. Entirely safe for humans, pets, or the occasional confused squirrel. But absolutely catastrophic for sensitive electronic. He made a note on his clipboard and muttered something about further review. I nodded politely and offered him a cookie. He declined. I knew then that this wasn't over. If anything, Karen was going to double down. That's what entitled people do. They escalate. And so I had to escalate too, not in pettiness but in precision. She wanted to play games? Fine. I'd play too. But I wasn't going to wait for another cord to snake its way across my fence. I needed to know the moment it happened. So I went back to the drawing board and did what I do best. I built a smarter trap. First, I upgraded the fake outlet. The original circuit had done its job, but I wanted real-time feedback now. So I added a hidden data logger connected to my home server, disguised inside an old garden gnome. Anytime something was plugged in, it would timestamp the event, capture the voltage draw, and send a notification to my phone. If it crossed a preset threshold, the outlet would deliver a carefully timed voltage spike. Not enough to start a fire, but enough to make any charging circuit go poof. And yes, I tested it thoroughly. On an old leaf blower. Twice. Next, I installed a set of motion-triggered cameras camouflaged as birdhouses and floodlight. They'd been lying in my garage from a past security upgrade I never finished. Now they had purpose. One camera faced the fake outlet. Another faced the back corner of Karen's yard where the ATV usually sat. A third watched the common fence line. All feeds were routed to my server and backed up to the cloud. If Karen even sneezed near that outlet, I'd have footage. But the real genius was the decoy extension cord. I left it draped over my own fence, coiled just so, as if I'd gotten lazy cleaning up after yard work. It was plugged into the dummy outlet and looked functional, but the wiring had been rerouted through a surge trip circuit buried beneath my flower bed. If Karen or her spawn decided to just yank the cord and use it again, they'd be in for another lovely surprise. 3 nights passed with no activity. I almost thought she'd learned. But on the 4th night, at exactly 1:42 a.m., my phone buzzed. Power draw detected. 2.7 kilowatt hours and rising. Then another alert. Surge threshold exceeded. Event triggered. I opened the live feed and watched in real time as a flash lit up the birdhouse camera. The extension cord twitched, the charger sparked, and the ATV gave a soft wheeze as if it were sighing its last breath. Karen's son, shirtless and confused, jumped back with the grace of a stunned deer. He scrambled to unplug the cord, but it was too late. Smoke rose from the charger again, not as dramatic as the first time, but just enough to make the point. I sat back and smiled. System worked flawlessly. By morning, the cord was gone again. But the damage had been done twice now. And I had video. Time-stamped, geotagged, and logged. This time, I didn't wait for the HOA to slap me with another nonsense fine. I printed off a stack of screenshots and walked them right into their office. The woman behind the desk, Janice, I think, flipped through them with wide eyes and a slowly growing scowl. "You're telling me she plugged into your outlet without permission?" she asked. "Twice," I said. "I've got full logs and footage. Also, check the bylaws, Section 8B, Unauthorized Utility Access." Janice pursed her lips. She knew the rule. But Karen was tight with at least 2 board members, and this wasn't going to be cut and dry. "We'll need to conduct a review," she said. "In the meantime, I recommend removing any outdoor outlets to avoid escalation." "Janice," I said, leaning in slightly, "this is an HOA that fines people for mailbox color but lets Karen run an illegal power hookup across property lines. I've been patient. I've been quiet. But I don't think you understand what kind of system I'm sitting on. If I wanted, I could cut my entire home from the grid and run off battery for 6 months. I don't need your outlet policy. I need you to enforce the rules. Or I'll take this footage to the city utility board and file a complaint for theft." She blinked, her mouth opening, then closing. "Your move," I said and walked out. That evening, Karen came stomping to my front porch. No mimosa, no sunglasses. Just fury. She demanded to know what I'd done to her ATV. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. She screamed that her son was traumatized. I said maybe he should stop stealing electricity. She threatened to sue. I said I had footage, logs, and an engineering degree that said otherwise. Then I handed her a USB stick. "What's this?" she asked. "Everything you need to realize you picked the wrong neighbor," I said, and gently closed the door in her face. She didn't knock again. But I knew this wasn't finished. Not yet. Entitled people like Karen don't give up after a single defeat. She would retaliate. She always did. And when she did, I'd be ready with more than just a surge circuit. I'd be ready with the truth, the law, and a neighborhood full of witnesses. Because it turns out, I wasn't the only one Karen had been stealing from. And once they found out, the real voltage storm would begin. 3 days after I handed Karen that USB stick, the fireworks began. Not literal ones this time, those had already played out with her smoking ATV charger, but the social, explosive kind. Karen didn't take the hint. If anything, she must have thought I was bluffing. Instead of backing down, she decided to double down in a way only a true suburban tyrant could. That morning, a police cruiser pulled into my driveway. The officer was polite but firm. Apparently, Karen had filed a report claiming I had knowingly installed a dangerous electrical device that endangered her family. I asked if she'd also mentioned that her family had plugged into my outlet without permission on my private property, and that I had security footage proving it. The officer blinked. She didn't mention that, no, he said, almost sheepishly. So I invited him in. I brought him to my office, pulled up the footage, and walked him through every frame. Karen's son plugging in the cord, the time-stamped logs showing power siphoning, the second time they did it after the first charger had fried. I even showed the outlet schematics, clearly labeled, wired to code, and rigged to trip under high current load. Completely safe to humans. Dangerous only to thieves. The officer leaned back in his chair and scratched his head. Wow, he said. You're not playing around. No, officer, I said. I'm not. But they are. And they're dragging the law into their tantrum. He closed his notepad. Look, from what I'm seeing here, she's got no case. This looks like theft of utilities, plain and simple. I'll write up my report. If she pushes further, you've got every piece of evidence to protect yourself. But I'll be honest, this kind of stuff usually dies when it hits the paperwork wall. I thanked him, and as he pulled out, I noticed Karen standing across the street, arms crossed, sunglasses on, sipping from what I assumed was her 5th iced latte of the day. She watched the cruiser leave, then looked straight at my house like she was daring me to come outside. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. I had bigger plans. Of course, the HOA wasn't done. The next day I received an official letter in the mail, complete with a gold-embossed seal like they were a royal court instead of a group of petty retirees with too much time. It claimed I was in violation of Section 12A, unauthorized electrical installations that posed a potential hazard to community safety. Attached was a fine for $500 and a mandatory inspection notice. Now I was angry. I filed my own complaint in return, backed with photos, logs, videos, and a full technical breakdown. I also CC'd the city's building inspector and the local energy utility board, because if the HOA wanted to pretend to be serious, I'd bring the real grown-ups into the room. But something unexpected happened next. A few neighbors started approaching me. First was Tom, the guy with the tricked-out outdoor kitchen 2 houses down. Then Nancy, who always waved but never said much. Then the Patel family, who ran a small catering business from home. One by one, they started asking me weirdly specific questions. Hey, you ever notice your fridge blinking like it lost power overnight? Do your motion lights ever reset by themselves? Did Karen ever ask if she could use your outdoor outlets? That last one hit a nerve. I asked them if they'd had similar power drop. Tom nodded. He said his outdoor mini fridge had started losing chill overnight. Nancy mentioned that her garden lights would flicker around 2 a.m. and then reset. The Patels said they'd had a whole freezer thaw out a few weeks ago because of a mysterious breaker trip. That was when it hit me. Karen hadn't just been stealing from me. She had been running a literal network of theft across the entire block. I invited them over for coffee and showed them my setup, explained how I tracked the power usage and how I had set traps to catch her in the act. When I played the footage of her son sneaking into my yard and plugging in the charger, they gasped. Tom burst out laughing. I knew she was shady, but this is Olympic-level theft. We formed a group chat later that day. We called it Shocked by Karen. Within hours, it had 10 members. By nightfall, it had 23. Turns out Karen had been getting free juice from half the neighborhood for months. She had her son plugging into unlocked outlets, outdoor garden ports, even one guy's RV hookup while he was on vacation. No one had proof until now. So we organized. Each neighbor checked their outdoor outlets and installed temporary lockboxes or covers. I helped Tom rig up a smart monitor. Nancy gave me the go-ahead to install a decoy cord at her place too. It wasn't just revenge anymore, it was neighborhood justice. We weren't just fed up with the theft. We were tired of the smugness, the manipulation, the way Karen thought she could walk through life like the rules bent around her. And then came the HOA meeting. Held monthly in the clubhouse, it was usually a snore fest filled with debates about flowerbed heights and acceptable patio colors. But not this time. We showed up in numbers. USB sticks, screenshot, time logs. One by one, we took the floor and laid it all out. Karen sat in the front row, arms crossed, jaw clenched, looking like a cat dropped in a dog park. She tried to speak. She tried to deflect. These people are exaggerating. This is all hearsay. They're just jealous. But the HOA president, Greg, one of her longtime allies, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Because even he couldn't ignore the numbers. Or the footage. Or the police report, which I handed him in a nice manila folder. And then, the bombshell. One neighbor had gone the extra mile and pulled their power bill from the past year. Their monthly average had spiked inexplicably around the same time Karen had gotten her ATV. Another neighbor matched dates from their breaker logs. Everything lined up. We'd built a case. A rock-solid, data-backed, idiot-proof case. Karen stood up and screamed that we were harassing her. That she was being targeted. That she had every right to access community power, since her HOA dues were so high. She actually said that. Community power. As if our personal property had become public domain. That was her final mistake. The room erupted in protest. Even Greg couldn't protect her now. The board voted to suspend her HOA privileges pending a full investigation. Fines were discussed. A restraining order was mentioned. Karen stormed out, nearly knocking over the punch table. But it wasn't over yet. Because one more revelation was coming. Something I hadn't even planned. Karen had been using the stolen electricity not just for charging her ATV. She'd been hosting backyard parties, full lighting rigs, mini fridges, even a karaoke machine, all plugged in discreetly to neighbor power. Her backyard had been a parasite-powered nightclub. And I had the footage. The storm wasn't over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. Following the heated community meeting and the subsequent suspension of Karen's HOA privileges, what had initially appeared to be a neighborhood nuisance rapidly evolved into a comprehensive case of coordinated utility theft with broader implications. The situation demanded a more detailed and technical approach, one that involved a careful audit of historical energy usage, metadata correlations, and a forensic review of footage spanning several months. Given the extensive complaints emerging from multiple residents, it became evident that the scope of Karen's behavior was not isolated to sporadic power siphoning. Instead, it demonstrated clear patterns of repeated, calculated abuse of infrastructure not belonging to her. The starting point for a deeper analysis lay in the data harvested from the decoy systems I and others had recently implemented. With explicit consent, I integrated additional smart monitoring devices across several properties affected by the unexplained energy deficit. The collective data, when time-synchronized and overlaid across the neighborhood power map, began to reveal a definitive surge pattern consistent with external charging equipment being attached and removed under the cover of night. The time-stamps aligned almost perfectly with footage showing Karen's teenage son moving between properties, often masked under the pretext of retrieving balls or performing yard-related tasks. Furthermore, I analyzed power phase fluctuations and identified transient voltage drops in the neighborhood's shared subgrid. These dips were not consistent with standard residential draw but were indicative of high-amperage induction devices, most likely inverter-based systems such as those used for electric vehicles or industrial-grade appliances. It was, by all accounts, a misuse of residential-grade power systems for equipment they were never intended to sustain, and that constituted not only a civil infraction but also a potentially criminal misuse of public utility access. As this analysis was compiled, I received communication from a city energy auditor, to whom I had forwarded my technical documentation. The auditor reviewed my report and confirmed its merit, noting that what began as private neighbor-to-neighbor theft now warranted classification as third-party utility fraud. According to municipal code, unauthorized and unmetered use of another person's electricity could, if the draw exceeded a specific threshold, result in both criminal charges and restitution demands. This was particularly relevant as Karen's misuse was not confined to a single incident or singular property, but rather stretched across multiple residences, with an aggregate impact calculated to exceed 3,000 kilowatt-hours over a 4-month period. In addition to the technical findings, social testimony from neighborhood residents corroborated the misuse. Several residents offered statements describing odd encounters: extension cords mysteriously snaking across lawns, lights left on in outbuildings they never accessed, or breakers tripping without explanation. One particularly illustrative example came from a neighbor whose smart sprinkler system had been inexplicably cycling off. Logs later showed brownouts that coincided exactly with Karen's late-night parties. These testimonials added a layer of circumstantial but persuasive evidence to the mounting case. During this same period, I finalized the reconstruction of Karen's party circuit, so to speak. By reviewing drone footage and analyzing luminance values captured from various security camera frames, I was able to identify the lighting and audio equipment she had been powering. The combined power load of the string lights, bass amplifiers, refrigerated drink coolers, and a portable karaoke system would have demanded a minimum of 2.2 kilowatts per hour, far beyond incidental usage. This power was, without exception, drawn through unauthorized connections routed via detachable cords running across fences, beneath hedgerows, and in one case, into an irrigation control box that had been rewired without permission. With this body of evidence, I worked with 2 of the affected neighbors to submit a formal complaint to the City Utility Board, requesting that a full audit be conducted on neighborhood energy allocations. Simultaneously, a private attorney representing one of the families began drafting a civil claim for damages. The strategy, as outlined, was multi-pronged: pursue Karen for direct financial restitution, refer the matter to local law enforcement for potential criminal charges, and press the HOA to amend its bylaws to include clearer language around utility theft and enforcement mechanisms. Karen, for her part, appeared either unaware or willfully ignorant of the escalating consequences. She continued to behave as though the community's coordinated response was simply a coordinated personal attack, often referring to it in dramatic terms during conversations overheard in passing, comparing herself to a victim of surveillance, mob rule, or neighborhood fascism, as she termed it during one particularly theatrical conversation outside the clubhouse. Her rhetoric, however, did little to counter the hard data arrayed against her. In the following days, the HOA, likely sensing that its credibility was now in question, convened an emergency meeting to address the situation. For once, the leadership abandoned its prior stance of passive deflection and instead moved swiftly to mitigate further liability. Karen was formally removed from all subcommittees, her access to communal amenities was revoked, and she was issued a formal notice requiring her to disconnect and remove any unauthorized electrical lines crossing property boundaries. What followed this administrative action was even more impactful. A certified letter from the local energy authority arrived at her doorstep, informing her that she was under investigation for meter tampering and utility theft under City Code 14.3.7. It included a request for a scheduled home inspection, to which she failed to respond. Non-compliance, according to municipal process, initiated the next step, a subpoena. As word spread of the investigation, the collective sentiment among neighbors shifted from frustration to vindication. Many of those who had suffered in silence for months now expressed a sense of validation, seeing that organized, rational resistance had produced results. Even residents who hadn't been directly affected began speaking out, expressing discontent over Karen's long-standing pattern of self-entitlement and disregard for communal norms. What remained was the final phase of accountability. The utility company completed its analysis and determined that the back-billed energy owed exceeded $1,800. Combined with HOA fines, legal fees, and property violations, Karen now faced a financial burden that could not be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding or neighborly dispute. The official documentation alone ran over 60 pages and included full resolution screenshots, legal definitions, comparative energy profiles, and a summation of community impact. At no point did Karen offer an apology or take responsibility. Even when confronted with the overwhelming evidence, she defaulted to denial. But in this situation, denial was not a defense. It was merely an admission that she had underestimated the capacity of her neighbors to respond not with emotional reactivity, but with precision, documentation, and strategic collaboration. The consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were measurable, enforceable, and backed by institutional authority. And yet, as I reviewed the final report, what struck me most was how easily this all could have been avoided had Karen simply asked. A single conversation, a neighborly request, could have changed the entire trajectory. But entitlement, when left unchecked, becomes its own form of delusion, one that, in this case, was dismantled one data point at a time. In the weeks that followed Karen's spectacular fall from grace, the neighborhood underwent something of a transformation. For the first time in years, people waved at each other with a genuine smile instead of a weary glance. The group chat that had started as a support thread against her theft slowly evolved into a place to share garden tips, neighborhood events, and the occasional meme about extension cord. We had, in a strange way, bonded through her chaos. What was once a cluster of quiet, disconnected houses was now a loosely united front of neighbors who actually spoke to one another, and the common enemy had been unplugged. Karen, on the other hand, was not adjusting well to her new reality. Her backyard was eerily quiet. The ATV, once a symbol of status and bratty rebellion, was gone. Rumor had it that it was sold off to help pay the restitution charges and legal bills she racked up after the utility company finalized its investigation. The karaoke machine, string lights, and suspiciously powerful outdoor speakers were nowhere to be seen. Gone were the Friday night raggers that turned the neighborhood into a low-budget Coachella. In their place was silence, and for some reason, an odd assortment of gnomes she had suddenly scattered across her yard, as though trying to reset her image as a harmless, quirky neighbor instead of a power-stealing menace. Her son, once the self-proclaimed prince of the cul-de-sac, had been demoted to common yard laborer. He was seen mowing lawns, collecting trash, and weeding driveways. Whether it was a punishment or an attempt to rebuild some goodwill among neighbors was unclear, but it was clear his ATV days were over. The kid avoided eye contact with everyone, and his once constant scoffing had turned into a quiet shuffle. Even he seemed to understand that some lines, once crossed, carry consequences far larger than anyone anticipates. Meanwhile, the HOA underwent its own reckoning. After the meeting where Karen's web of theft was laid bare, several board members either resigned or were voted out. New elections were held. This time, the community actually participated. People who never cared about bylaws or ballots suddenly showed up with clipboards and ideas. A former firefighter named Gwen was elected as the new president. She wasted no time in drafting a revised charter, one that explicitly outlawed utility theft, authorized random inspections for complaints, and included automatic fines for tampering with electrical setup. It also limited how close power-related setups could be to property lines and required inspection tags for all outdoor systems. I was asked to serve on the Safety and Infrastructure Subcommittee. I politely declined the position but agreed to help advise from time to time. Gwen, to her credit, respected that. She understood that I wasn't in it for the politics. I had no interest in the spotlight. I just wanted my neighborhood to stop feeling like a stage for someone else's nonsense. With the new policies in place, several residents decided to upgrade their electrical systems. I ended up helping more than a few neighbors install tamper-proof outdoor outlets and showed others how to monitor their usage with simple tools. Some even joked that I should start a business. You could call it ShockGuard, one neighbor said. I laughed, but the idea of turning all this into something productive did stick with me. As for Karen, the final blow came in the form of an actual eviction, not from her house but from her illusions. The city had officially fined her for utility theft, the HOA had billed her for repeated violations, and the neighbors she once lorded over now avoided her entirely. She was isolated, disgraced, and metaphorically depowered. But she still tried to cling to her old persona. One afternoon, during a mild spring day when several of us were out doing yard work, Karen emerged from her house dragging a long, squeaky garden hose. She strutted to the center of her yard like she still owned the street and began spraying her flower beds, loudly humming to a song no one could hear. She wore oversized sunglasses and a bright pink tracksuit that practically demanded attention. But no one gave it to her. Conversations continued, rakes scraped, and lawnmowers buzzed without pause. She tried again a few days later. This time, she pulled out an old battery-powered speaker and began blasting music toward her yard. A few heads turned. Someone in the group chat posted, "Karen's testing the airwaves again." But just like before, no one took the bait. She couldn't stir chaos without power, and this time we meant that literally. I checked my cameras less and less as the weeks went on. The decoy outlet stayed untouched. My logs stayed clean. I'd almost considered removing the system entirely, but something about it felt right. Like a badge. Not one of war, but one of vigilance. A symbol of what happens when good people stand up against repeated disrespect, even when it comes masked in pastel yoga pants and faux-friendly smiles. One day, I was adjusting my solar grid when I heard a voice behind me. "Hey!" I turned around. Karen was standing just on the edge of my property line, looking like she hadn't slept well in days. No sunglasses. No posturing. Just her. "What is it?" I asked calmly. She hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to, I guess I owe you an apology." I stared at her, surprised but not moved. "For which part?" I asked. "The theft? The lies? The false police report? Or the HOA circus?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the bluntness. "All of it," she mumbled. "I messed up. I didn't say anything." She cleared her throat. "I didn't realize how serious it was. I thought it was harmless." "It's never harmless when you take something that doesn't belong to you," I said. "Especially not repeatedly." She nodded. "I get that now." We stood in silence for a beat. "Well," she added awkwardly, "just wanted to say that." And with that, she turned and walked back to her house, slower than usual, quieter. I didn't forgive her in that moment. I didn't even believe she meant it completely. But maybe it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand that electricity wasn't the only thing she'd been draining. Later that evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the rooftop. The sky was orange, the air still, and for the first time in months, I felt an actual sense of peace. No buzz from the ATV, no chords where they didn't belong, no sudden spikes on my monitor. Just silence and the soft sound of wind rustling through the trees. Some neighbors walked by and waved. A kid rode past on a regular bicycle, not a souped-up electric machine. I smiled. Peace, it turns out, wasn't something you wait for. Sometimes you have to design it yourself. Wire it carefully. Protect it fiercely. and if someone tries to steal it, well, you give them a charge they'll never forget.